They say freedom is never free. It is carried on the shoulders of those who gave more than they had to give. Some sacrifices are remembered with medals, parades, and speeches. Others live quietly, whispered through the lives of those who survived. This story isn't about victory or defeat. It's about a promise, one made in the dust of battle, carried across highways and state lines, kept alive by memory and love stronger than death. Stay with me, and together we'll walk beside Helen Monroe, a woman who carries not just her own past, but the legacy of a friend who never came home. If stories like this touch your heart, I'd love for you to follow along. Leave a comment with your thoughts and share this with someone who believes in the quiet strength of sacrifice. The highway stretched before her like an endless scar across the land, its surface cracked and bleached from years of sun and rain. Helen Monroe gripped the steering wheel with both hands, the leather worn smooth under her palms. The van rattled with every mile, a tired machine that had carried her farther than most would have trusted it to go. On the dashboard, the old compass trembled with each bump, its brass edges dulled with age. Propped against it was the photograph, creases along its surface, corners curled, faces frozen in a moment that no amount of time could erase. Helen glanced at the picture again. Two young women in combat gear, dust on their faces, rifles slung carelessly as though war were just another day's work. They were smiling in the photo, Rachel Dawson, all teeth and fire in her eyes, and herself, a much younger Helen, shoulders squared and grin half crooked. The memory tugged at her, and as always, she whispered under her breath, "I told you I'd take you all the way, Raw." The van groaned in agreement, its engine coughing like an old soldier. She tapped the gas pedal gently, as if coaxing a stubborn animal, her lips twitching into the faintest smile. No music filled the space. No voice from a GPS guided her. Only the rhythm of the wheels on pavement and the faint rattle of tools in the back kept her company. That and the ghost of Rachel's laughter, echoing somewhere between memory and silence. It came back to her often without warning. One moment she was watching the pine trees sway on either side of the highway, their top bending toward the late summer skyline. The next she was back in the thick of Coast Province, the air heavy with dust and the smell of gunpowder. Bullets pinged off metal, smoke burned her throat, and Rachel's voice cut through static and chaos on the comms. Helen could still feel her friend's hand gripping her shoulder, the urgent whisper pressed against her ear. "If I don't make it, don't you dare waste your life drinking cheap wine and watching reruns. Drive across this country, every state, every town, see what we fought for, understand it." The helicopter had only room for one. Rachel stayed behind. Helen never forgave the war for that. She never forgave herself either. The sign for Fort Liberty appeared ahead, 2 miles. Helen adjusted her sunglasses, cheap plastic from a gas station, and straightened in her seat. The sun dipped lower, spilling gold across the asphalt. Her van coughed again, this time with more insistence than sputtered. She slapped the steering wheel lightly. "Not now, girl," she muttered. "Don't you quit on me here." The engine sputtered twice more, then fell silent. Helen guided the van off the main road, wheels crunching against a narrow service path until it rolled to a reluctant stop just past a faded chain-link fence. The base perimeter loomed only a stone's throw away. "Well, Ra," Helen exhaled, pressing her forehead against the wheel for a beat. "Looks like we're making a pit stop." The heat hit her as soon as she stepped out. Gravel bit into her boots, and sweat clung to the back of her neck beneath the old ball cap shielding her eyes. The smell of scorched earth and distant jet fuel drifted on the breeze. From somewhere beyond the trees, the rhythm of boots striking pavement echoed. A drill formation, young soldiers moving in unison. For a moment, Helen stood still, caught between two worlds. The present, where she was just a woman with a broken van, and the pit, where every sound was a reminder of loss. Shaking herself free, she popped the hood. Steam hissed faintly from the radiator, curling into the heavy air. She pulled a rag from her back pocket, wiped her hands, and crouched low, sliding beneath the van with the ease of long habit. A wrench clicked against a bolt, her arms straining against rust and stubborn metal. To anyone passing, she might have looked like nothing more than a mechanic too proud to call for help. But just beneath the strap of her tank top, etched into her skin, was a symbol that carried more weight than her weary shoulders should have borne. A black stallion within a silver shield, wings etched along its sides, fire licking at its hooves. Ghost Company 7, a unit so secret most believed it a myth. Those who carried its mark either lay buried in foreign soil or lived like Helen, walking ghosts themselves. The bolt gave way with a sharp crack. Helen's lips pressed tight, not in triumph but in the quiet focus of someone who had long ago learned to endure. She reached deeper into the engine block, muttering under her breath, "You're not dead yet, just stubborn, same as me." The sound of tires on gravel broke her concentration. She stilled, listening. A Humvee rolled to a stop nearby, its tan frame casting a shadow across the hood of her van. Three young soldiers stepped out. Their uniforms were crisp, boots polished, faces still carrying the roundness of youth. One held a clipboard, his expression pinched with authority. Another hid behind aviator sunglasses far too large for his narrow face. The third, taller, already wore a scowl. "Ma'am," the tallest called, voice clipped, "this is restricted military property. Step away from the vehicle." Helen didn't answer. She twisted her wrench again, loosening another clamp. "Ma'am," the clipboard soldier pressed, tone sharper now, "you can't park here." Helen slid out slowly from beneath the van, wiping her hands across her jeans. Her eyes, shaded by the brim of her cap, remained calm, steady. "Didn't park," she said simply. "Broke down." "Still restricted," the soldier insisted. "You'll need to call a tow. Move it now." Helen's gaze flicked toward the perimeter fence, then back to the boy barely out of training standing before her. She could have argued. She could have told them she'd been here before they were even born, that she'd bled on ground they only studied in manuals. But she didn't. Instead, she set her jaw and returned her hand to the van. "I'm fixing it." "That's not allowed," the soldier with aviators added, his voice a little too tight, as though rehearsed. "You're too close to the base perimeter. We'll have to call security." Helen exhaled slowly, eyes narrowing just slightly. "I'm not in the way. 15 minutes and I'll be gone." "That's not how this works, ma'am," the tall one snapped. Helen wiped sweat from her brow, then bent again toward the open hood. She wouldn't beg. She wouldn't fight. She had promised herself years ago that she would never raise her voice to children wearing uniforms too heavy for their shoulders. The memory of Rachel's words came back, steadying her. "Don't stop, Helen. Don't ever stop." The gravel behind her shifted again. This time it wasn't the heavy rumble of a Humvee. It was smoother, quieter. Helen didn't need to look to know the vehicle carried weight far heavier than rank alone. She straightened slowly, rag still clutched in her hand, as a black SUV rolled up beside the soldiers. Dark-tinted windows reflected the low sun, military plates catching the last of the light. The rear door opened. A tall man stepped out, hair gray at the temples, posture still sharp despite the years. 4 stars gleamed on his collar. General Marcus Hayward. The young soldiers snapped to attention, their arguments dying in their throats. The general's gaze swept the scene. The broken-down van, the grease-stained woman in a ball cap, the tense young men frozen like statues. His eyes landed on Helen and stopped. For a moment, the world stilled. His breath caught. Then his gaze dropped to the ink on her shoulder, the black stallion in its shield. The silence cracked open when General Hayward lifted his right hand to his temple in a salute, sharp and precise. The soldiers stared, bewildered. Helen, grease streaked across her arms, sweat dampening her shirt, blinked in surprise. Slowly, almost reluctantly, she straightened her back and gave a small nod in return. In that moment, everyone knew she wasn't just another woman on the side of the road. They had just threatened a legend, and Helen Monroe had just stepped back into a world she thought she had left behind. The air hung thick with heat and unease. Gravel crunched beneath the boots of the 3 young soldiers as they shifted, glancing between the woman before them and the general whose salute had left them stunned. None of their manuals, none of their training drills had ever prepared them for this. A grease-stained civilian commanding respect from a 4-star general without a single word. General Marcus Hayward lowered his hand slowly, his gaze never leaving Helen Monroe. His voice carried none of the sharp edge of command, yet every syllable was weighted with recognition. "Is there a problem here?" he asked, not to Helen, but to the soldiers who only moments ago had threatened to radio security. The clipboard soldier stiffened. "No, sir, just handling a perimeter breach." Hayward's eyes flicked from the boy to the van, then back to Helen. His jaw tightened, and for a moment the years seemed to melt away, his memory pulling him back into smoke and fire. "A perimeter breach," he repeated, his tone softer than expected. He took a step closer to Helen, his gaze fixed on the tattoo barely visible beneath her tank top strap. His throat worked once before he spoke again. "Ghost Company 7. The words landed like a stone dropped into still water. The soldiers shifted again, uncertain, the name meaningless to them, but heavy with unspoken weight. Helen's lips twitched, not quite a smile, not quite denial. "Used to be," she said, wiping her palms against her jeans. Hayward inhaled sharply. "Monroe," he murmured, as though testing the word after years of silence. His eyes lit with something between relief and sorrow. "Helen Monroe." The young soldiers exchanged glances, their confusion deepening. To them, she was just a woman with a broken van. But their general's voice carried the reverence one reserves for battlefields and memorial walls. Helen's eyes narrowed, studying him. "You were at Firebase Kestrel," she said. Not a question, but a recognition. He nodded once. "I remember you. You pulled 2 of our boys from the rubble when the barracks collapsed. You called in a drone strike to cover the ridge as it gave way." Neither smiled. They didn't need to. Recognition wasn't always joy. Sometimes it was survival remembered in silence. The taller soldier finally spoke, his voice unsteady. "Sir, she is not to be bothered." Hayward cut in sharply, turning on his heel to face them. His words cracked like gunfire, steady and final. "She is to be assisted. And someone get a mechanic out here immediately." The soldier with the clipboard snapped his mouth shut and fumbled with the radio, nearly dropping it in his haste. The other 2 stood frozen, eyes darting between Helen and their general, trying to reconcile the woman before them with the weight of legend now attached to her name. Helen exhaled, the tension easing from her shoulders, though her heartbeat still drummed heavy in her chest. She glanced toward her van, then back at the general. "You didn't have to do that." Hayward's lips pressed into a thin line. "Yes," he replied quietly, "I did." For a moment, silence stretched between them, thick with memory. Then faintly, Helen heard the scuffle of gravel as the mechanic arrived. A man older than most soldiers, sleeves rolled up, hands already stained with oil. He didn't salute, didn't speak, just gave Helen a single look, half reverence, half question, before sliding under the van with practiced ease. The younger soldiers lingered, restless. Their authority had evaporated the moment the general saluted. Now they stood in the presence of something they didn't understand, a living remnant of stories whispered in barracks, half remembered from books and half believed around late-night campfires. Helen leaned against the side of her van, arms crossed. The sun glinted off the chrome, catching the faded lines of the tattoo on her shoulder. She wasn't trying to show it, but she didn't hide it either. To her, it wasn't a badge of pride, only memory carved into flesh. Hayward stood beside Iban, his posture still straight, though time had etched its weight into his face. "I thought Ghost Company was a myth," he said finally. Helen's laugh was low, almost bitter. "We liked it that way." "I had a buddy," Hayward continued, voice quieter, "who swore you all walked through fire without flinching." Her eyes stayed on the horizon. "We flinched plenty. We just didn't stop." The words lingered between them, as steady as the hum of cicadas in the heat. The clipboard soldier approached tentatively, clearing his throat. "Ma'am," he began, his voice softer now. "I didn't know." Helen's gaze softened, though her expression stayed firm. "You weren't supposed to," she said simply. Before the boy could reply, the mechanic slid out from beneath the van, wiping his hands on a rag. "Clamp was loose," he muttered. "Simple fix, she'll run again." He glanced at Helen, eyes flicking briefly to her tattoo, then back to the van. "Wouldn't leave you stranded here." Helen inclined her head slightly. "Appreciate it." The tension began to ease, the edge of confrontation dulling into something quieter. Yet beneath the calm lay an undercurrent of change. Something had shifted in those young soldiers. They had walked up ready to dismiss a woman as a nuisance. They were leaving having glimpsed history standing in the dust. Hayward turned to Helen once more. "You're not just passing through, are you?" Helen reached into the van, pulling out the worn photograph. She handed it to him with care, as though the paper itself carried the weight of bone and blood. "She was my best friend, Rachel Dawson." Hayward studied the faces in the photo, his thumb brushing lightly across the image of the two women. "I remember her name," he whispered. "She didn't make it out," Helen said softly, "but before the last mission, she made me promise. Carry her picture across every state. Learn what freedom looks like." Hayward returned the photo with both hands, the gesture solemn, like presenting a folded flag. "That's a hell of a promise," he said. Helen tucked it back onto the dashboard. Her eyes lingered on the image, the corners of her mouth trembling. "I wasn't ready to keep it then, but I'm ready now." The young soldiers shifted again, their postures no longer tense but reverent, as though afraid to break the fragile gravity of the moment. Hayward broke the silence first. "There's a hall inside the base," he said. "No cameras, no ceremony, just soldiers who should hear from someone who understands what sacrifice really means. Would you consider it?" Helen's fingers brushed the photograph once more. She thought of Rachel's voice in the chaos of Coast Province. "Don't think. Just keep crawling." Her chest tightened. Slowly she nodded. "I'll stay, but no speeches, no medals. I won't stand for that." "No ceremony," Hayward promised. "Just listening." Helen glanced back at the young soldiers. Their eyes were wide, their faces etched with something deeper than discipline. Respect, quiet awe. For the first time in years, she didn't feel like a ghost. She stepped away from the van, toward the gate. The gravel shifted beneath her boots, each step carrying her not back into war, but into something unexpected. An invitation home. And in that moment, Helen Monroe realized her journey wasn't just about keeping Rachel's promise. It was about carrying their story into the hearts of those who would carry it forward. The base awaited, silent but open, and she walked toward it. The meeting room smelled faintly of dust and oil, the kind of space used more often for briefings than for anything resembling ceremony. Rows of folding chairs had been arranged in uneven lines, their metal frames scraping against the floor as soldiers settled into them. A few older non-coms stood along the walls, arms folded, eyes steady, while younger privates whispered to one another, their curiosity barely contained. No cameras, no flags, no staged speeches, just a room filled with soldiers waiting to hear something they didn't yet understand. Helen Monroe stood near the back, her arms crossed over her chest. She hadn't asked to be here, not really, but Hayward's quiet insistence had carried a weight she couldn't easily shake. She hadn't set foot inside a base since the day she hung up her uniform. Yet now here she was, grease still staining her skin, her heart pulled back toward memories she'd worked so long to bury. General Hayward stepped forward to the podium, though he didn't stand behind it like an officer about to deliver orders. He rested a hand on its edge and spoke without notes. "We spend a lot of time in this room talking about drills, about deployments, about tactics," he began. His voice carried with the ease of someone used to command, yet softer now, steadier. "But today you're going to hear something else, something you won't find in manuals or in training videos. You're going to hear the truth." The murmur in the room faded into silence. Every soldier's eyes turned toward him. Hayward's gaze swept across the crowd, then found Helen at the back. "Some of you may not recognize her. Some of you may think she's just another civilian who wandered too close to the perimeter. But I tell you now, she's the reason some of us are still standing. She served in a unit that officially never existed, Ghost Company 7. The name rippled through the room like a spark dropped into dry grass. A private leaned toward his neighbor, whispering, "I thought that was just a code name in that old Delta Force book." Another shook his head, disbelief mixing with awe. Hayward's voice lowered. "Yalris Valley, 2006. I was there nearby, running recon along the ridges. Ghost 7 went into that valley knowing the odds were against them. Outnumbered, outgunned, cut off. They didn't just survive, they saved 32 American lives that day." A silence fell heavier than any command could enforce. One of the sergeants along the wall bowed his head, fists clenched tight at his sides. Hayward stepped back slightly, his eyes shifted toward Helen. "She won't say it herself, but she was there. And if she'll allow it, I think it's time you heard from her." Helen's chest tightened, her throat dry. She hadn't planned on speaking, not really, but the faces turned toward her, the young, the old, all waiting, pulled something from deep inside her. Slowly she walked forward, her boots tapping softly against the floor. She didn't stand behind the podium. Instead, she rested one hand lightly against it and faced the room directly. "You want the story?" she asked, her voice low but clear. "Fine, but I'm not telling it for applause. I'm telling it so you understand what this tattoo means." She tugged the strap of her tank top aside just enough to reveal the mark burned into her skin, the black stallion in its shield, wings spread, fire curling at its edges. Some gasped, others only stared. She inhaled once, steadying herself. 7 of us were dropped by helicopter east of Yalras. No backup, no air support, just orders. Mines littered the ground. Snipers perched in ridges. Spotters with radios were calling every move we made. We lost Ramirez within the first hour. Pressure played under the bend. He never had a chance. Her jaw clenched, but her voice didn't break. Her gaze swept across the room. Rachel patched me up when shrapnel hit my leg. She always carried more than the standard kit, said regulations were written by people who never got shot at. A few soldiers chuckled quietly, but Helen didn't smile. We made it to the valley floor by nightfall. That's when the signal flare lit the sky. Not ours. It was bait. And then the thunder came, 30 rifles firing at once in the dark. If you've never heard that sound, count yourself lucky. It doesn't sound like gunfire. It sounds like the sky splitting open. A projector clicked on behind her, grainy satellite images of the valley flickering to life. Helen didn't turn to look. She didn't need to. Every inch of that place was burned into her memory. They had us pinned on 3 sides. A medevac bird had gone down south of the ridge. No one else was coming. So we did. Suppressive fire, crawl, drag, move. Rachel on point, me hauling a wounded airman uphill 50 yards with rounds snapping past my head. She stayed on comms, even though she wasn't supposed to. Kept talking to me the whole time. Said, "Don't think, just keep crawling." Helen's voice cracked. She paused, letting the silence breathe, then went on. "The last evac bird wouldn't wait. We had 1 seat left. I carried the last survivor, shoved him onto the rope, told Rachel to grab on behind me. She shook her head, smiled that damn smile. Said, 'You owe me a road trip. Don't waste it, Helen.' Then she stayed behind, firing until we were out of range." The projector clicked off. The room was silent. Not a cough, not a shuffle, just the sound of Helen's breath, steady though her eyes glistened. A young corporal near the front swallowed hard. "Ma'am, why haven't we ever heard any of this?" Helen's gaze softened, but her answer was blunt. "Because it was classified. Because after we came home, the world moved on. And because people like Rachel didn't get medals, they got buried." Another voice rose from the back, quieter. "Why didn't you ever ask for recognition?" Helen looked down at her boots, then back up at the sea of faces. "Because we didn't do it for recognition. We did it for the person standing next to us. That's it. That's the only reason worth fighting for." Her words lingered in the heavy air. Hayward stepped forward, standing beside her without speaking for a long moment. Finally, his voice came quiet, almost reverent. "I can still hear her voice on the comms. I never knew her name. Now I do." Helen nodded. She would have liked that. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full of memory, of weight, of something unspoken passing from one generation to the next. And in that silence, Helen Monroe understood. The story wasn't just hers anymore. It belonged to them now too. The room remained hushed long after Helen finished. It was not the silence of boredom or indifference, but the kind that hung thick and reverent, pressing down on every chest. A row of young privates stared at her as though seeing, for the first time, the living embodiment of stories they thought were only myths. Even the older sergeants, men who had fought their own battles, stood a little straighter, eyes fixed on her like students unwilling to miss a word from a teacher they hadn't known they needed. Helen shifted her weight, leaning one hand against the podium, though she still refused to step behind it. She was not here to deliver orders or to posture with authority. Her tone carried no grandeur, no pretense, only a weary honesty forged in places these soldiers had only studied in field manuals. "You need to understand something," she said, her voice steady despite the tension in her jaw. "That tattoo on my arm doesn't mean heroism. It doesn't mean glory. It means we made it back and someone else didn't. She glanced toward the door for a moment, her gaze caught in the echo of memory. Every mark, every scar, every night we survived meant we were carrying someone who couldn't. That's the truth of it. A soldier in the second row, barely out of his teens, swallowed audibly. His knuckles were white where his hands clasped together. Helen met his eyes briefly, then continued. You've all heard phrases like freedom isn't free. They're printed on mugs and bumper stickers. But what they don't tell you is that freedom costs names, faces, voices. People who laughed with you one day and weren't there the next. You think of war as battles and strategy, but in the end, it's about seconds. Who gives theirs away so you can keep yours? Her words cut through the room like a blade wrapped in velvet. No one moved. Even the faint hum of the ceiling fan seemed to fade. She straightened a little, brushing sweat from her brow. Rachel Dawson was my seconds. She gave me hers, and I intend to spend every one of mine remembering her. That's why I drive. That's why I keep moving. Every road is one more heartbeat she should have had. Every mile is one she never saw. At the mention of Rachel's name, the general shifted slightly at her side. His face remained composed, but his eyes betrayed the weight of her words. A private near the back raised a tentative hand, uncertain if he was even allowed to speak. Hayward gave him a nod. The young man cleared his throat. Ma'am, do you regret it? Serving, I mean? Helen's gaze lingered on him, sharp yet gentle. I regret the losses. I regret not finding a way to bring Rachel home. But I don't regret standing where I did, because she was there too. We don't get to choose the price, only whether we're willing to pay it. The answer settled heavily on the room. Several soldiers lowered their eyes, as if weighing her words against their own untested futures. Helen took a slow step forward, her boots scraping softly. Don't mistake what I'm telling you. I'm not here to preach, and I'm not here to warn you off. You already chose this life, and you'll bear its burdens. But I will tell you this, never fight for medals. Never fight for recognition. Those things get lost in files and ceremonies. Fight for the person standing shoulder to shoulder with you. Because when everything falls apart, that's the only reason that matters. She let the silence stretch again. Several soldiers nodded faintly, their eyes moist, though their expressions remained hard. Hayward finally broke the stillness, stepping forward. His voice was low but firm. That's what Ghost Company taught us. Sacrifice doesn't echo in parades, it echoes in people. You all carry that now. Helen turned back toward the room, her eyes softer. You'll face your own choices. Some of you will come home changed. Some of you might not come home at all. And when that time comes, you'll understand that the stories you carry will outlast you. Just make sure they're worth carrying. The soldiers breathed as one, a collective exhale that felt almost like a vow. At the edge of the room, an older sergeant, who hadn't spoken all evening, suddenly cleared his throat. His voice was rough, weathered by years. Ma'am, with respect, I served in Jalalabad in '08. We heard about Ghost 7, but we didn't think it was real. I just want to say thank you, not for what you did, but for finally telling it. Helen inclined her head, her lips twitching into the faintest smile. We weren't supposed to be remembered. But if you remember Rachel's name, that's enough. The mechanic from earlier, still leaning quietly against the wall, gave a slow nod of agreement. He had been silent through it all, but his eyes said what his mouth did not. Acknowledgement, respect, solidarity. Hayward raised his voice again, not as an order, but as an invitation. I want each of you to remember this day, because what you've heard here won't be in any archive. It won't be on any official record. It's ours now, passed from her to you. Carry it well. Helen looked down for a moment, then back up. Stories like these don't belong to ghosts. They belong to the living. The soldier sat straighter, as though absorbing that charge directly. Then, unexpectedly, a ripple of movement swept through the room. It began with a single corporal in the front row who stood abruptly. His boots echoed against the floor. Then another followed, then another, until every soldier in the room was on their feet. No applause, no words, no fanfare, only a silent standing salute. Helen did not return it in the traditional way. She placed her hands slowly over her heart and gave a single nod. That was enough. The silence that followed was not heavy this time. It was full, carrying with it respect, memory, and something like hope. Later, as the soldiers filed quietly from the room, some paused to nod at her, some to shake her hand. Not all spoke, but all left carrying a weight that was no longer invisible. General Hayward remained at her side until the last uniform had disappeared through the door. Only then did he turn to her, his face softened by something she hadn't expected. Gratitude. You gave them something they won't forget. Not a story, a truth. Helen's lips curved into a tired half-smile. Rachel always said the truth mattered more than the legend. Hayward exhaled, a long, steady breath. Then you honored her tonight. Helen looked at the now empty chairs, rows of silence where eager faces had been. Her chest tightened, but it wasn't the weight of guilt this time. It was something closer to release. For the first time in a long time, she felt that Rachel's voice wasn't fading. It was echoing forward. The hallways of Fort Liberty felt different after the briefing. The walls were the same muted beige, the floors the same polished concrete, but the air itself carried a stillness that hadn't been there before. Soldiers passed Helen Monroe quietly, their eyes catching on her as though trying to reconcile the image of a weary traveler in grease-stained jeans with the whispered weight of a legend. No one stopped her. No one asked for photos or autographs. Respect lived in silence, and silence was what they gave her. General Hayward walked at her side, hands clasped behind his back, his stride slow enough to match hers. You did more than tell them a story tonight, he said softly. You gave them a compass. Helen shook her head. I gave them Rachel. That's what they needed. Hayward glanced at her, his jaw tightening for a moment. And you think you gave them nothing of yourself? She didn't answer right away. Her gaze lingered on a bulletin board covered with routine postings, shift schedules, lost and found notices, a flyer for a charity run. Ordinary things, unremarkable. Yet tonight, even those mundane reminders of base life seemed threaded with a deeper awareness. Soldiers moved differently, carrying their gear with just a fraction more care, speaking to one another in quieter tones. It wasn't change you could measure, but it was there. When they reached the end of the corridor, Hayward stopped. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small weathered box. Opening it, he revealed a silver coin etched with a five-pointed star and the words, "For honor, for silence." He held it out to her. It's not much, he said, but it's ours. A token we give when words aren't enough. Helen's eyes flicked down to the coin, then back to his face. For a long moment, she hesitated. Finally, she extended her hand, closing her fingers around the cold metal. I'll keep it, she said quietly. Not for me, for Rachel. Hayward nodded once. That was all the ceremony either of them needed. The following morning, Helen woke to the smell of strong coffee. Mara, a cook from the mess hall, had pressed a steaming mug into her hands without a word. Black, no sugar, just the way Rachel used to drink it. Helen sipped slowly, the bitterness grounding her as she walked toward the motor pool. Her van sat there, almost unrecognizable. The mechanics had worked through the night, replacing belts, flushing the oil, polishing the chrome until it caught the morning sun. The old dents had been patched, and the engine now hummed with a steady confidence it hadn't had in years. Someone had even tucked a sealed envelope into the glove box. Helen tore it open to find a hand-drawn map marked with fuel stops, military museums, and scenic routes. At the bottom was a simple note: you're not alone on this road. Keep going. Fort Liberty Motor Pool. Helen chuckled softly, shaking her head. Always did have better logistics than the rest of us. Before she left, Hayward intercepted her near the flagpole. The early sun cast long shadows across the parade ground where rows of soldiers stood assembled. Their formation was precise, yet the atmosphere carried none of the usual stiffness of drill. Instead, it thrummed with expectation. Hayward turned to her. Would you mind saying a few words? Helen stiffened slightly. I'm not good with crowds. He gave a faint smile. Neither are most heroes. Minutes later, she found herself standing in the open, a single microphone set up at the edge of the grass. No podium, no stage, just her, the morning air, and the sea of soldiers standing at ease before her. She cleared her throat, her hand brushing unconsciously against the edge of her shirt where the tattoo lay hidden. I'm not here to tell you how to serve, she began. Most of you already know that better than I ever did. But I will tell you what I learned from someone who didn't come home. Her voice carried over the silent field, soft yet unshakable. She used to say freedom isn't found in the big speeches or the parades. It's in the quiet things, in the space between chaos and calm, in the seconds someone gives you by standing between you and danger. That's not in textbooks. It's not in ceremonies. It's in sacrifice. And for me, it's in Rachel Dawson. The soldiers didn't shift, didn't whisper. They simply listened. Even the birds seemed to pause in the trees. She gave me the rest of my life, Helen continued, her throat tightening. So I spend it trying to understand what that means. Every mile I drive, every town I stop in, is another piece of the freedom she never got to see. Her voice cracked once, but she pressed through it. Don't forget, freedom is not an idea, it's a person. It's someone saying, go, I've got this. That's what it costs. That's what it's worth. She stepped back from the microphone, unwilling to say more. There was no applause, no shouted approval. Instead, one by one, every soldier in the field straightened. From the youngest private to the most weathered sergeant, they raised their hands in perfect unison, offering a silent salute. Helen didn't return it in kind. She placed her hand over her heart and bowed her head slightly. That was enough. The salute held for several breaths, then lowered as one. The silence that followed was heavier than thunder, yet filled with something that made Helen's chest ache. Not guilt, but belonging. Later, as she packed her few belongings back into the van, Hayward joined her at the gate. You sure you don't want to stay longer? He asked. Helen zipped her bag shut. If I stay too long, I might forget how to drive stick. He laughed softly, but the humor faded quickly. You changed something here. You may not see it, but I do. Helen glanced back at the rows of barracks, the motor pool, the parade ground where silence had spoken louder than any speech. Her lips curved into the faintest smile. Maybe, but I think they changed something in me too. The van's engine turned over with a smooth purr, ready for the road ahead. She slid into the driver's seat, the photograph of Rachel still propped on the dashboard where it had always been. With 2 fingers, she tapped it lightly. Still with me, Ra. As she rolled toward the exit, a young soldier stood guard, his helmet slightly tilted, his cheeks sunburned from the morning sun. As the van passed, he raised his hand, not in the crisp, traditional salute of regulation, but in the secret sign of Ghost Company. 2 fingers to the temple, then tapped gently over the heart. Helen's breath caught. Her chest tightened, and she returned the gesture, slow and deliberate. The gate opened. The road stretched wide. And with the weight of silence behind her and Rachel's memory beside her, Helen Monroe pressed gently on the gas. The salute lingered in her rearview mirror long after the base disappeared behind the trees. It was not just a farewell. It was a vow carried forward. The van rolled smooth and steady along the highway, its engine humming with a new confidence that hadn't been there before. Helen Monroe sat behind the wheel, shoulders relaxed in a way she hadn't felt in years. The morning sun stretched across the asphalt, casting long bands of light through the windshield. With each passing mile marker, Fort Liberty shrank further into the distance, but the weight of what she carried there did not fade. If anything, it seemed to settle deeper inside her, not as a burden, but as something steadier, like an anchor finally lowered. She glanced at the dashboard where Rachel's photograph remained propped against the compass. The edges of the image had frayed from years of travel, but the faces inside it were untouched by time. Rachel's grin still blazed with the same fire, and Helen's own younger self still wore that half smirk of defiance. She tapped the photo twice with her fingers, a quiet ritual. Still with me, Ra. Always. The road wound through a stretch of trees, their branches bending toward one another like an archway. Helen lowered the driver's side window. Cool air swept inside, carrying with it the scent of pine and the faint trace of gasoline from passing trucks. The sound of the wind filled the van, drowning out the echoes of silence that had haunted her for years. For the first time in a long while, the noise wasn't oppressive, it was liberating. She thought back to the soldiers standing in formation, the field filled with silence more powerful than any applause. That image stayed with her, vivid and unshakable. For years, she had carried her story alone, tucked away like a scar no one was supposed to see. But now it lived in others, in the young men and women who had stood at attention, their eyes full of something she hadn't expected. understanding. At a gas station outside a small North Carolina town, Helen pulled over to refuel. The pump groaned as it filled the tank, the numbers ticking upward, slowly. She leaned against the van, stretching her back, the faint ache in her shoulders reminding her of long nights and longer roads. A family parked nearby, parents ushering two children out of an SUV, their laughter bright and careless. Helen watched them for a moment, a small smile tugging at her lips. This is what Rachel wanted, she thought. This is the freedom she wanted me to see. The simple things, the quiet lives untouched by war. Back on the highway, the map from the Fort Liberty motor pool sat folded on the passenger seat. Red pen marked fuel stops, military museums, scenic byways, and shortcuts through countryside roads. At the bottom of the map, the note repeated itself in looping handwriting. You're not alone on this road. Keep going. Helen touched the paper gently. She hadn't expected that. For so long, she believed her journey was solitary, just her and the memory of Rachel against the endless miles. But now, it seemed, others had chosen to walk beside her, if only in spirit. Knoxville, Tennessee was scrawled as her next destination. Helen had no idea what she would find there, and that uncertainty didn't bother her. For once, not knowing felt like freedom itself. As the miles slipped away, she let her mind drift. Memories rose and fell like the hills she drove through. Rachel's voice over comms, Ramirez's laughter before the mission, the sound of rifles cracking like thunder. She remembered the feel of Rachel's hand on her shoulder in that final moment, the strength of her grip, the impossible steadiness of her gaze. That memory had once been unbearable. Now it was a promise renewed with every turn of the wheel. The day stretched on. Afternoon heat shimmered across the road, distorting the horizon into waves of gold. Helen pulled into a rest stop, sipping from a thermos of black coffee Mara had handed her that morning. She sat on the hood of the van, the photo balanced in her lap, watching the sky shift toward evening. A few truckers passed by, nodding polite greetings. No one recognized her, no one asked who she was. She was invisible again, and somehow that felt right. Legends weren't meant for statues. They were meant for stories whispered where they mattered most. As night approached, Helen turned the headlights on. The beam cut through a tunnel of trees, the sky above thick with stars. The hum of the engine steadied her heartbeat. For years she had driven without knowing if she was moving towards something or just away from the past. Now she knew. She was driving into Rachel's promise, into the freedom they had fought for but never fully seen. At the state line, Helen slowed the van just long enough to glance at the sign welcoming her into Tennessee. She tapped the photo again. Another one down, Raw. 31 left. Her voice cracked slightly, but there was no bitterness, only determination. Somewhere along the dark stretch of road, her mind replayed the final moments at Fort Liberty. The young soldier at the gate, his helmet tilted awkwardly, his salute not the crisp gesture of regulation, but the quiet, unmistakable sign of ghost company. 2 fingers to the temple, then pressed over the heart. The image brought a sting to her eyes, her chest tightening with an ache, both sharp and comforting. That gesture had told her everything she needed. The legacy wasn't gone. It lived on, not in archives or medals, but in the hearts of those who chose to carry it. She returned the gesture in the memory of that moment, her hand moving instinctively. Temple. Heart. Still here, she whispered into the night. The miles rolled on. The van rattled less now, its engine steadier, its frame stronger, as though it too had been given a second chance. Helen leaned back into the seat, the wind rushing in through the window, carrying with it the faintest echo of Rachel's laugh. And for once, instead of being haunted by the sound, she let it guide her forward. This wasn't just a road trip. It was a promise, a pilgrimage, a way of making sure Rachel's sacrifice didn't fade into the forgotten corners of classified files. Every mile was a testament. Every town was a chapter. And every soldier who had stood in silence at Fort Liberty was now part of the story too. Helen Monroe pressed the gas gently, her eyes fixed on the stretch of highway disappearing into the night. "I'm still going, Ra," she whispered. "I'm going to see it all, for both of us." And with that, the van carried her forward, into the dark, into the unknown, into the freedom that waited on the